Hello, today I'll be assessing the impact of the World Trade Organization on African economies. So what is the World Trade Organization? The World Trade Organization essentially is an organization with the purpose of liberalizing trade and in helping trade flow as freely as possible and ensures a level trading field for all countries, and it essentially should spur economic growth and development. The WTO is the predecessor of GATT, which is a general agreement on tariffs and trade. Basically, the main difference between GATT and the WTO is the GATT mainly dealt with trade in goods, whereas the WTO and its agreements covered trade in services as well as intellectual property. And as you can see in the bottom right graph, the WTO is extremely powerful and it has a heavy influence on international economies and has endured large growth in the recent years. So, how important is Africa in the WTO? About 27% of Africa or of the WTO members are African, and this shows that Africa is very well represented in the WTO because 28% of all countries are African, so that helps show that. About 80% of the least developed countries in Africa or in the World Trade Organization are African nations. And in 2017, merchandise exports of least developed countries increased 13%. And although this is a sign in the right direction, there's still a lot of room to grow. About 0.6% of world trade is held by these least developed countries, and they make up 22% of membership in the WTO, so there's a lot of room to be done. At the same time, although there is a lot of room, this does show there's great economic potential, which is what we're going to discuss in the next slide. So what is Africa's economic potential? If we want to talk about how the WTO affects Africa, we want to know, in what ways can it possibly help reach its potential? And it's a widely known fact amongst many economists that Africa is an untapped market which is on the cusp of economic prosperity. In 2011, the Harvard Business Review even pointed out that Africa is home to many of the world's biggest opportunities. Agriculture plays a huge role in Africa. By 2030, the food and beverage sector is expected to generate $740 billion of value for the African economy, and that's almost double the next largest predicted sector. As you can see in the top right graph, agriculture plays a huge role in the African economy. Sectoral employment for the agricultural industry takes up a larger percentage than any other continent. So as the African economy grows, so will its middle class, and therefore purchasing power for the average household will increase. And so this is also why many foreign countries have started to invest in Africa, because there's a thriving middle class. Foreign direct investment actually reached $73 billion in 2014, and that's up from $14 billion in 2004. This is because countries have started to take notice in how much potential there is in African economies and how much money there will be to be made. One quick thing is East Africa is actually already a leader in global payments, so this is why it's no surprise that direct investment in Africa has just grown exponentially. So what is the importance of trade for economies? Before I delve into the importance of the world trade on Africa, basically world international trade has occurred since the earliest civilizations began trading, but in recent years it's actually become extremely important because there's a larger share of GDP devoted to exports and imports than ever before. International trade also is an important factor in raising living standards, providing employment, and enabling consumers to enjoy a greater variety of goods. So it does obviously help the morale and the overall well-being of countries that experience that are able to participate in it. So, what are the advantages of the World Trade Organization if you're an African country? As you can see in the graph, most countries in Africa are experiencing tremendous growth in GDP. The three exceptions are, oftentimes because of political turmoil and things unrelated to real economic deficiencies. So membership in the WTO gives African markets immediate access to developed markets at lower tariff rates. This is extremely important because lower trade barriers also allow African nations larger markets for their goods that they can export to economically prosperous nations. And so this leads to more sales, more jobs, and in theory should spark economic growth. I do say in theory because it's extremely hard to assess the exact metrics of what international trade does to an economy, because measuring GDP is such a wide scale. But it can definitely be said that part of GDP growth can be attributed to open trade. Africa's share of global production has actually risen by 30%, and its share of trade by more than one-third recently. These expansion rates are built from a very low base, but still an indication that Africa is on the move in the right direction. And free trade has also been made possible by the bringing down of all barriers so that goods and services can travel freely around the world and set up a global market. This also leads to the African middle class rapidly rising, as I discussed in a few slides ago. And liberalizing trade also brings a set of regulation and a set of order to African economies. The WTO essentially implements specific policies and specific specific processes that all membership members must face uniformly. They all must conduct these policies and these procedures. And one example is maybe you want to move a large tractor from Uganda to Chad, and if they're not WTO members, they have to figure out how to transport maybe every single part, or transport them by train, by car, and it can be extremely costly and extremely ineffective and not productive. But the WTO has a set of procedures for these types of trade transactions, and this is a lot more efficient, and it helps bring a sense of stability and order in regions like least developed countries that might not have very much of that. So in a sense, the WTO brings a very strong sense of stability in trade. So moving to the disadvantages. It is known, actually, the WTO has, as discussed by Patel, is known to favor the interest of multinational companies at the expense of African and other poorer countries. And it also guarantees transnational corporations access to foreign markets without requiring these transnational corporations to respect their domestic priorities. And so basically, one big thing is that these short-term corporate profits are favored take precedence over more ethical issues, and they take precedence over things such as sustainable development, social standards, health safeguards, democracy, and the care for environment. And so this raises a real ethical concern when the WTO has leaned towards economic prosperity at the expense of things like the environment and ethics. And with all the competition that comes with the WTO, comes these big, huge countries, the U.S., China, EU countries that have a lot more access to cheaper products and have bigger profit margins and making more profit, and so they flood African countries with their lower priced products. And so basically, it puts African countries at an unfair playing ground, because they often lack the resources to compete with the large nations that flood their market with cheaper goods. And as stated earlier, many least developed countries are consisted of African nations, and in effect, they gain very little beyond a binding for agricultural goods and manufacturing goods at a higher rate than the average for recently added least developed countries. Sometimes, implementing these policies I discussed and the advantages can be costly. So for a newly initiated WTO member, maybe like South Sudan, if you want to implement the customs valuation agreement, which is based on the principle that the declared value of imports should be the basis for valuation, it requires a series of demanding steps to be followed before the use of a different price can be justified. And essentially, this causes poor countries to spend money that they might not necessarily have, and so implementing WTO procedures can also be costly in that sense. In conclusion, it's widely known, as I discussed, that Africa will play a huge role in the world economy in the future. And yes, it's true that it does definitely have its drawbacks. Economic prosperity is favored. Multinationals are favored at the expense of African farmers, at raising ethical concerns. But at the end of the day, trade liberalization is essential if African countries want to maintain growth and want to get out of poverty. And as the Austrian-American economist Joseph Schumpeter termed creative destruction, it has been a part of economic life for centuries, and it can bring pain, and that's what open trade can do that. But history tells us that countries seeking to block incoming goods, services, or ideas often find their economies stagnating, and that's exactly what Africa cannot afford to suffer. And that's why, despite the drawbacks that do come with being a member of the WTO and free trade, it will be essential in the end for Africa to reach its goals. Thank you very much. This is my works cited, and I hope you all have a great break.